Hi everyone, this is Pip from the JFK Living team, and we are here with another live interview. We've been doing these interviews throughout the month of June, talking about fair housing and discrimination within various sectors. We've touched on race, we've touched on sexuality. Today we're going to be talking with Dave Gorham from Realty Solutions Property Management about the Fair Housing Act, disability and service animals, which I can't wait. So without further ado, I'm going to bring Dave into the conversation. Dave, hi, how are you?
Hey, Pip, I'm good.
Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm glad you could be part of the conversation that we're having this month.
Yeah, happy to do it.
Absolutely. So why don't you just kind of briefly give us a little bit about your background and, how you got to where you're at today? Because I know you also work as, New Jersey licensed and a CE instructor for Next Local Board.
Yep. So I've been in real estate for 25 plus years, mostly on the side of investments and rehabs and being a landlord. So on the sales side, we started a property management company 20 years ago. And in that realm of being a broker, I got licensed as an instructor for the state. I've got to coach a fairly large team, different levels, right? So community management, property management, brokerage, and we also have a law firm. So all those acumen, I got to have a pretty solid coaching academia, especially for fair housing. So, we do this every day. So the fair housing thing kind of comes up, and it's not for the faint of heart, because it's a black and white issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's still, unfortunately, there's still so much discrimination that goes on within the industry that's perhaps not spoken about.
And sometimes unknown, right? Sometimes unknown by the person that might be doing the discriminating, right?
Absolutely. And all we can do then is educate people and keep bringing it into the forefront and shine some light on it. And hopefully there's some people out there who are watching this or listening to this that go, oh, I didn't know that.
Correct.
And change their minds and they change the way in which they do business. And that's what we're here for, right?
Yeah, absolutely. From a public standpoint, and also from, the professional standpoint. Yeah.
Great. So, of course, today we're going to talk about fair housing. We're going to talk about disability, service animals, and renting and the discrimination that still does occur. So, firstly, I wanted to touch on the difference between what is a service animal and an assistance animal, and why that's important to distinguish the difference between those two.
Yeah. So I think that we're doing this publicly, not necessarily just to realtors, right? Even though you and I are realtors, there's professionally on our side of the business, I think we use them interchangeably, and that is a benefit to us. Right. As professionals, that we do that, because there really is, from a fair housing aspect, there really is no distinction that we need to make. An assistance animal and a service animal, to us, the same thing. We can't discriminate. But from a definition standpoint, assistance animal, they're the easiest one to look at is like a guide dog for a blind person, right? That is a service. They're specifically trained to do a task.
Okay.
An assistance animal might not be trained to do a task, as they might actually be used for comfort. Could be for anxiety. It could be for pain. So there are specific things that delineate between the two. For our purposes in professionalism and fair housing, there is no distinction. If you track it back to what the protected class is, the protected class is persons with disabilities.
Okay.
So it's really not the discrimination towards the dog or the cat or the bird.
Right.
It's the discrimination against the individual who's blind who has the dog, or the individual who has PTSD and has the cat. I like to explain it to the professionals in the room on the discrimination part, is that you wouldn't look at the wheelchair as a separate thing in that person's disability.
Absolutely.
It's a tool. right? Yeah, it's a tool. So in the case of a bird who might hear something like a doorbell for hearing impaired, or the cat that has that helps with anxiety, or the dog who's a seeing eye dog, they're not a pet,
Mhm.
and they're not technically they're an animal, but in reality they're a tool that
Mhm.
disabled person uses to have I don't want to say normal life, but for lack of a better term, a normal life, like
Mhm.
a regular out and about kind of a life. So that
Absolutely.
as a tool, and that helps delineate it a little bit. So us as professionals, we can talk to landlords and tenants,
Mhm.
buyers and sellers about it.
Yeah, and some of these animals, they're so necessary. I mean, obviously, everyone knows about guide dogs and hearing dogs for the deaf, but
Easy, right?
I used to work in the hospitality industry years ago, and we had a client came into the restaurant regularly with a severe nut allergy, where like even just the slightest trace of anything, she would go into anaphylactic shock, and she trained her poodle to detect any
Sniff out.
traces within the food, and he
Yeah,
was like on it.
yeah,
And he did, and he saved her life on several occasions.
yeah.
And
And they're so in that case, it's a tool, right?
Mhm.
I was reading up on the differences between it, and what occurred to me was the bird example that I gave is, someone has hearing impaired, the bird will alert the resident or the owner of the house that the doorbell's ringing
Right.
or the phone's ringing. That's pretty, that's pretty deep. You get in there and you see all these nuances. I think what's unfortunate is, at least from where we're sitting as professionals, um, we see or we have to navigate suspicions that maybe our clients might have,
Right.
right? We're suspicious of, and when you can tell a story, people are less suspicious, right? Because I identify with you because
Mhm.
you've told me a story about that dog,
Right.
and I can understand that.
Yeah.
The challenge has become in fair housing. You can't necessarily really ask what the disability is, so
Mhm.
it would have to come up in natural conversation.
Right, absolutely, and that's one of the things that I was reading about was you can't really ask for much more of a description
Yeah.
as to what someone's disability is or what their service animal is for, other than the fact that they have one.
Yeah.
Other than a letter from their doctor or therapist, is that correct?
Yeah. So the two different categories come with some regulations. The assistance or support, we'll say emotional support, that's a little bit looser. And
Mhm.
like you said, a letter from or a note from a medical doctor or a therapist is good enough for us,
Right.
right? To verify that. It's like pre-qualifying a buyer to be able to get into a mortgage, right?
Okay.
That qualification is enough. A service animal might be a little bit more specific, where they're specifically trained, so they come with more official paperwork.
Mhm.
And I think that's what trips up the public in what is official and not official. HUD would do us all a favor if they came out with some more guidelines or some clear regulations across the board
Mhm.
for restaurants, for
Right.
realtors,
Right.
for anybody. But as far as I'm concerned, and the people that I train, is if they can, if they say it and they can verify it,
Mhm.
it has to be allowed.
Okay, gotcha. So the Fair Housing Act, it states that landlords are required to make reasonable accommodation, quote unquote, to
Sure.
allow service animals. So what does that mean exactly?
That means the lawyers made up that word reasonable.
Yeah,
Right?
I did notice. I was like, well, it's kind of a vague term.
Yeah. If you read through the landlord tenant book, I think it may come up like a dozen times.
Right.
Reasonable. Yeah. So I look at it from our standpoint is, if, again, using the animal as a tool, right? Reasonable accommodation for someone bound to a wheelchair would be a ramp, right? So reasonable becomes, can a ramp be put in
Mhm.
under normal safety guidelines, and it is not a hardship for the owner, right? So it doesn't say that the owner has to do it.
Right.
It says the owner has to allow for it.
Mm-hmm.
So the tenant, or the buyer could do it
Mm-hmm.
and pay for it. A hardship might be that it's too steep, and the money or maybe the zoning buffering zone wouldn't allow for it. That's a hardship, and the owner might not be able to go through that kind of zoning for it. But the tenant would be responsible to actually pay for it in that scenario. So when it comes to animals, it's kind of the same thing. Reasonable accommodation for any animals is almost inherently okay, right? Because it's a dwelling. So most dwellings are going to have allow for animals in it. We're animals, right? So we're in the dwelling. One of the tricky pieces comes into play would be with insurance, where if we own a house, our homeowner's insurance will allow for large breed dogs, right? As an example, when we turn that house into a rental, it's a business now. Usually, insurance companies, at least in New Jersey, have restricted large breed dogs for any claim. So that would be a hardship on the landlord if, say, a tenant had a German Shepherd, large breed dog. The landlord, in essence, would have to say, yes, we can do it. We'll allow for it, but my insurance precludes it. You would have to get a rider on the insurance to do so. So the landlord is allowing for it. It's within reason, and there's an accommodation to take care of his hardship in that case, or her hardship.
Okay. All right. Interesting. So, what information can a landlord seek if a person with a disability and or service animal wants to rent their unit and they need a bit more literature information about it?
Sure. It goes back to that difference between a service animal and assistance animal. If the way I look at it from fair housing, because we're teaching this and we're coaching on it, and we have professional standards to adhere to. We look at it as if the tenant can verify, if that person can verify through a letter, through some certification, if it's a service animal, then it's okay. Because again, there's no true across the board national regulations on that. It really comes down to good faith, right? So we want to err on the side of that good faith.
Okay. Are there any examples of housing that is actually not covered by the Fair Housing Act?
In general, yes. So in general, it would be a single family home that someone is renting out, possibly themselves, not through a realtor, that's under 4 units.
Okay.
There's exemptions there. There's also exemptions for familial status in senior housing, or sometimes adult active communities. Religious organizations get an exemption on the religious discrimination aspect of it, if it's if it's non-commercial. Right. So there's a little caveat to, say, you and I, if we were landlords and lived in a unit, if I owned more than 4 properties and was a professional landlord, I would not be exempt in my own property. So there's little nuances in it as to it, and that's through New Jersey's LAD. It's called LAD, so it's Law Against Discrimination. So they have a department for that. They have a specific department for that. Okay,
interesting. And if your landlord refuses to accommodate your service animal, what can you do about that?
Well, so you'd want to file a complaint, or, well, let's back up, right? So I'm all about let's negotiate, right? Or let's educate. So the first thing I would tell someone, whether it was professionally or personally, is seek to understand a little bit more. Why is it that they think they can discriminate? Because they might not think they're discriminating on that level. And the more that they educate, people do open up. for you and I in our offices, we have a little bit of a protection with our documents that are written by the Attorney General, right?
Mhm.
Which says if Pip's a client of mine and Pip says, no way, I'm going to discriminate, I can say, no way, I'm not going to work with you, tear up an agreement and walk away. So I think the first step is education. The second step is if you can't get that, if you don't get reasonable satisfaction, then you go to government agencies.
Okay.
If it was in Jersey, you go right to the state's website. It's the law is the Law Against Discrimination Act. They actually have a department. It's a civil rights department. Yeah, the instructors interface with that department based off of these specific fair housing criteria. And then you go to the big guns. You go to the HUD, right? HUD.org, and you look to get some satisfaction there.
Okay. Do you see this happening frequently still in today's society, or is it kind of like few and far between?
Yeah. So I guess there's two ways to answer that question, right? So I might see it more because I'm educating on it. And I might see examples of professionals asking questions. So that makes me think that there's more of it. But I think in daily business, I haven't seen it on the street. That doesn't mean that it's not happening, right, in our industry, whether it's redlining or blockbusting. That stuff is as recent as 3 and 4 years ago.
Right.
So I do think we have, again, capitalism just keeps marching on, and we as humans, we always try to find ways through, and sometimes we start to step on those fair housing laws. So that's what they're there for, is to bring us back to have that discussion. So I don't think it's something that's set in stone and set it and forget it. I think it's something you continually discuss.
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why us as realtors, every 2 years, we have to take a portion of ethics where we go over things like the Fair Housing Act, because you need those refreshers. Sometimes you get into your standard way of working, your mind slip, you focus on one thing and you forget something that you should have ordinarily remembered. So, we always try and keep ourselves like up to date and abreast of all of the laws, because there's a lot of them.
Yeah, there is, and there's nuances to doing business. Like, you do business differently than I do business as a realtor, but the laws are the same. And I think what gets us into trouble as realtors serving the public is that we think we become an advocate, maybe for our client, right? So we think in defending them, it's doing the right thing professionally, but sometimes we step on some fair housing issues,
right,
by trying to defend or trying to serve them in what we feel is the best way. Right. When the real question is how do you want me to serve you? Right? Not me making that judgment call in an expectation. It's an agreement. It's an out loud agreement. Pip, how do you want me to serve you in this transaction? Yeah.
That's exactly right. So Dave, do you have anything else that you'd like to add to the conversation on disability and service animals?
No, to all the professionals out there, don't go to HUD jail, because it's not fun.
Understood. Noted.
No. I think we hit on some really good topics, and in a setting like this, I'll teach a 3-hour class, a 2-hour class, sometimes a half-hour class. Something like this really kind of boils it down and makes people have to think about it from a black and white perspective. So this has been great.
Excellent. Great. Well, Dave, listen, I'm very much excited to come and attend some of your classes in the future. And thank you very much for joining us today to talk about this issue. And all the best, and stay safe and well. And keep on going with business.
All right. Thanks.
And we'll see you next time around. Bye-bye.
Yeah,